Hi, and welcome to day 4 of the summit. We have been having some great discussions all week, and today I am looking forward to our discussion on diversity in corporate America, employment, and housing. I want to introduce our panelists today who will lead us through this discussion. And just reading your bios, I already know this will be a very engaging and informative discussion, much like what we've been doing this week. So first, I would like to introduce Nadine Smith. Nadine Smith is the Executive Director of Equality Florida, the state's largest organization dedicated to ending discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. An award-winning journalist turned organizer, Nadine was one of 4 national co-chairs of the 1993 March on Washington. She was part of the historic meeting between then President Clinton, the first Oval Office meeting between a sitting president and gay community leaders. She served on the founding board of the International Gay and Lesbian Youth Organization. Welcome, Nadine.
Thank you.
Next up, we have M.A.S.C. Mr. West is a pioneering author, educator, and hip-hop artist who can be best described as a Renaissance man, leveraging a broad and diverse set of skills and interests to advocate for marginalized communities. Since 2014, he has served as Senior Managing Director for Teach for America's LGBTQ+ Community Initiative, which advances safer and more supportive classrooms for students and their educators. Since returning to his hometown of Cincinnati in 2017, Tim has served his community as a CPS Strategic Planning and Engagement Committee member, a Wordplay Board member, and a member of the Chase LSDMC, among other points of engagement. Tim taught at both secondary and post-secondary institutions, including Oakland Schools for the Arts, Cesar Chavez in Washington, D.C., Humboldt State University, and Houston Community College. Prior to TFA, Mr. West served as Director of Youth Services at Center on Halsted, Chicago's LGBTQ center and the largest in the Midwest. A graduate of Duke, the New School, and Stanford Universities, Tim released his definitive music anthology, Prodigal Son, which captures 20 years of hip-hop, soul music across 6 solo projects. So welcome to you both. Impressive bios for sure. So what we would like to do today is I'll ask a few questions. And then the way that we've been doing this is that the both of you can sort of go back and forth. There may be some questions that start out for one or the other, but please feel free to join in. We want this to be a conversation and a discussion. We will also have some time at the end of this meeting where we'll get some questions from social media and then we'll go from there. Okay, so
Right.
First I'll start with you, Nadine. Can you tell us about your background and what you feel is most important in your life story?
Well, I grew up in Florida, specifically the Panhandle of Florida, which is a very conservative part of the state. And, grew up in an atmosphere that was not very welcoming certainly to LGBT people, not very welcoming to Black folks either. And I think it shaped me in a number of ways because my family prepared me to navigate racism. I had a safe harbor that, taught me to not let other people's negative opinions impact me, to always keep my eyes on the prize. They just didn't realize that they were also teaching a young lesbian those same lessons. And so for me, the journey of the country on LGBT issues has also been the journey of my family, from rejection to acceptance to being sort of outspoken supporters. And we see now a country where 83% of Americans across religious affiliation, across party lines, believe that LGBTQ people deserve the same rights that they enjoy in their lives and for their families. So I think the things that really shaped me were coming from an activist family. My grandparents were organizers in the Mississippi Delta, moved my father up to, as a small boy, up to New York to escape that racism, but we're always organizing. And so I think I was shaped by that, and also the desire to be the adult that I wish had been there for me when I was a kid, when I had questions, when I felt alone. And I know how so many LGBT young people end up isolated, rejected, thrown away, self-medicating, suicidal. And so for me, it's always been, I want to be that adult that I wish had been there when I was a kid.
I'm sorry, but the psychologist in me can't let that go. I think that's a powerful statement that you just made. And I was sitting here wondering, like, what are some of the things as a child that you wish you had from the adults around you?
Well, you know, one time at a speech, I asked the room to imagine if from the day you were born, you'd been accepted as for who you were. So that would mean never having a relative ask me, "Oh, you got a little boyfriend yet?" Not make assumptions about my sexual orientation. Being able to experience falling in love for the first time without the fear of discovery and all of the ways that you know, tarnishes one's ability to fully experience love and support. To never doubt that my family would be there for me. To never have to wonder at any point whether I didn't get the job, didn't get the, you know, wasn't selected for something having nothing to do with my abilities or talents. And I was, you know, saying that to this audience of people just to imagine that world. And there were two older gentlemen in the front who were clearly in tears. And I thought it was because they were so moved by that imagining, you know, just sort of walking through what life would have meant. And so I asked one of them if he would mind sharing. And he said, I'm crying because I couldn't do the exercise. I couldn't even imagine that world that you were describing. And so for me, that is, I want that vision. I want to be able to, you know, sort of get rid of the poisons that I ingested, the internalized homophobia, you know, just like internalized racism, it gets delivered to you from a very young age from people who ought to be protecting you, and it takes a lifetime to unpack it.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. I think you just gave us all a charge to do better and think about how we can create that reality for children, for people, even adults, right? Like, and make that something that's not just imaginable, but attainable in, like, in actuality. So thank you. Tim, could you please explain the importance of inclusion and community in the, or I'm sorry, let me read that again. Could you please explain the importance of inclusion in the community and in the workplace?
Absolutely. And, you know, inclusion is an important term. A lot of people throw it around, but I think sometimes get it confused with a lot of other things. And I think that as a champion of inclusion and as someone who's experienced a lack of it in white dominant spaces, I have always been adamant about aspirations for the Black community to exemplify and embody the inclusion we never experienced. So I actually get a little bit more upset when Black people are not being inclusive because I feel like we can show up in a way that we have not been shown. You know, diversity is inviting people to the party. I've heard inclusion as asking someone to dance. And I would even like to push this a little bit further. I love the fact that we're talking about belonging in these spaces. Belonging is actually asking if the person likes the music that you're asking to dance to. I think often we can have inclusive environments where we bring people in, we even ask them to participate, but we don't ask them to shape the culture that exists, right? And I think belonging is true. Like I'm not just there, I'm not just sort of representing a group, but I've actually been asked what I like and what I like to see. And so I like to push us to think about inclusion in that space. In terms of the workforce, it's really interesting, and I appreciate Nadine sharing sort of going back and to sort of growing up as a Black queer guy. There were certain professional opportunities I thought were not available to me if I were to accept and live my life in full truth, right? And so the pathway to being a quote unquote strong Black man, from what I was taught as a little kid, part of that necessitated burying a part of my identity and a part of myself. I've been in professional spaces where I've been told, even in education, that like, oh, it's unprofessional for a Black man to bring his sexuality to an education space or a workspace. And so I lead by the title Brave Educator. It's who I am on Twitter and Instagram and all that stuff, because I feel that leading bravely, walking in full truth, and being an example that people can see in particular education spaces or where I am, is so important. It's so important for the kids at the community center or the elementary school where I donate my time to see, oh, there goes Mr. West. He comes and checks on us. He donates his time and economic resources. Oh, and he has a partner named Andre, right? And we see Andre sometimes too. And I think to speak back to your point, like the power of me having seen that when I was a kid. Now, what's interesting is I went back. I'm born in Cincinnati, but I went back to Southwest Arkansas, where I grew up, small country town. So when you say the Panhandle, I feel you. But when I go back to Southwest Arkansas now, I actually see that the LGBTQ community was already there. I didn't have a lens to notice it because it was so muted. It was so silent. We didn't talk about that. People talked about, oh, that's so-and-so's friend, right? And you were supposed to pick up on that code, or, so-and-so was never married, hint, hint, right? So there were all these codes. And when I went back as an adult, having experienced my life in full truth, it's everywhere. We exist everywhere. So inclusion is less about the fact that we're there, because we are already there. I think the call to inclusion is about acknowledging, recognizing, naming our presence in these communities in a way that's affirming, right? And I think somehow, I think a lot of our respectability politics, the idea is that like you can't be successful and identify in this way. Notions around shame, don't shame your family, or keep it all quiet, or nobody needs to know your business. These are all things that we hear in Black communities, and I feel that we can't be our best selves. We can't be our best Black community if we are constantly asking people to sacrifice their true selves.
It's real.
Yeah, thank you for that. That sort of leads into this next question, Nadine. So as you've mentioned, you're in Florida, in the South. So what was it like for you when you decided to not only live in your truth, but to apply your activist spirit and skill set towards the LGBT community, becoming the first openly gay Black to run for Tampa City Council?
Well, I had been a reporter, and I was in the closet as not entirely, not to my colleagues, but I wasn't really out. And I remember that there was a pastor who was progressive, who brought forward in a coalition with some gay activists, a human rights ordinance. And nobody thought there was any chance of it passing. But what was eye-opening for me was, because I was a reporter and I had access to city council members and political leadership, including when they weren't standing in front of the public, I heard some of the most homophobic, ugly comments being, said backstage, as it were. And I remember it deeply affected me, because I thought to myself at the time, I can be a reporter and I can dispassionately write about these things, but not change them. And for me, the work of changing them suddenly became front and center. And I remember, shortly after I left the newspaper, I volunteered to be part of a local organizing for what became the 1993 March on Washington. And over time, I just kept moving into different leadership positions until I was one of the 4 co-chairs. And we were all very young and very idealistic. I hope I'm still idealistic, but we had big ideas. It was sort of a collective national consciousness raising about the world that we had a right to be born into, and what it would take to manifest that world. And so, sort of From my college days when I had gotten involved in forming the International Gay and Lesbian Youth Organization, to that moment, there wasn't a path. There wasn't a bunch of statewide organizations. There weren't a lot of paths to do this work full-time and professionally. And so a lot of us worked temp jobs and spent as much time as we could organizing around passage of local ordinances. But eventually there were enough people who shared that vision. So the journey has been, now practically every state has a statewide organization. This year has been our biggest, most ambitious voter mobilization effort. More than 500,000 pro-equality voters, not just LGBTQ people, but that growing number of people for whom equality and equity are litmus test issues. And, so it has grown a great deal, but we're also in the midst of some pretty aggressive pushback. So the work continues. I will say one thing about, Tim's point about diversity and inclusion and how the difference between whether or not it is window dressing or whether or not, there's a deeper impact. And, I ask myself, if ever I say, oh, there's a different voice in the room, or there's a missing voice, we need to bring that voice into the room. I think one of the questions has to be, is the room different now because that voice is there? Or did we just bring somebody who would not change anything of the dominant structure into that space to feel better about it, what we're doing? And I think that what we're seeing more and more in corporate America is a growing realization that changing the composition of the picture is not the same as incorporating the vision and the values and the perspectives of the emerging demographics in America. And you've got to actually be a different company. You've got to be a different organization because of those new voices.
I love that you both bring that point up, because I think for so long people, I know we're talking corporate America and things like that, but I'm thinking about universities and different organizations where they also say, well, we're diverse. Look at this picture. We have these people, as our employees, as a part of our organization. But now I'm sitting here thinking about, okay, but how are they included in the dance, in the music? Where is their voice heard? Are they supported in that environment? And how can we make sure that that's the direction that we're going in? Because it can only, I feel in so many ways, like improve the work that these organizations and corporate America is doing, because it's more representative of the people that they're serving in that way. Yeah. So Tim, this next question is about negative stereotypes that often start at a very early age, and thinking about, how do we interrupt those negative stereotypes, and what are some healthy engagement tools that we can use to instruct youth, or that you found useful in instructing youth?
It's interesting. I mentioned about the importance of showing up as my full self to spaces, the importance of that. So I think some of what allows stereotypes to persist is a lack of proximity to people that are different. And I think, what I don't want to move into is, especially as, I'm very clear that I'm a Black queer man that has greatly benefited from cisgender privilege because I show up in the world in a particular way. I've been a varsity basketball coach. I show up as masculine. If I didn't say who I was or who I loved, you might not know. And some people regard that as a good thing. I don't think I would call it good or bad, but I do think I understand it as a privilege. But I also understand that as a privilege that enables me to be there and speak up for people that are not being allowed in the room. So for example, education has been my lane, but we see this also in corporate spaces. It shows up in diversity, equity, and inclusion when we have great spaces for Black gay men in HR, right? Like it's known that that's a place where we see a lot of Black gay men in corporate spaces. There are a lot of Black men who are queer that are principals of schools, but they don't talk about their families. They don't talk about their personal lives. They're encouraged not to do that. So again, there's this trajectory of, be yourself, but not too much, right? Because it's somehow going to impact, sorry, you got sirens here. It's somehow going to impact how people see you, that respectability thing, which is why it's important for journalists and for civic leaders who are LGBT, and it's particularly in the Black community, to be visible, because kids need to see that the possibilities professionally are there for them in a variety of areas and spaces. When I did supports for Gay Straight Alliance organizations at high schools, I would always make it a point to bring in, a Black lesbian doctor or a Black transgender accountant, because our kids needed to see your orientation and your identity isn't everything you are. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people in the straight world, once you tell them your orientation, that's about all they see. They forget that you have intellectual interests, that you like certain kinds of music, that we are diverse as Black LGBTQ folks as anybody else, right? With different kind of political affiliations and things like that. And so I think we get away from the stereotypes when we provide people to an exposure and an array of different kinds of people without the judgment. I think what I too often see is someone saying, well, Tim, we like how you show up in the world because you present in this way, but we don't want those femme guys, or we don't want guys with particular body types, or, it's almost like there's only one way you have to be to meet this respectable idea. And I say, yes, fats, and yes, femmes, and let's bring everybody to the table and let everybody succeed and thrive, because success to me looks a lot of different ways. And we can't say that we're about the business of inclusion if in our own Black LGBT communities, if in our own professional pipelines, we are discriminating and pushing people to the margins.
Absolutely. I think the theme of the night is just like, one, being able to provide these opportunities for people to show up as their authentic selves, and then being able to accept and embrace people for who they are authentically without our judgments or trying to decide what we will, what version we will or will not accept. But I think, as you're talking, and we hear a lot of talk about representation as you think about children, when you're seeing adults live authentically who they are, and you're having these questions about who you are, it opens up those possibilities. Like, okay, well, I have these questions. I see someone, living their life and looking happy. Okay, it's not this bad thing that I should be ashamed about.
Absolutely. Not even say, as someone that works in education, the curriculum is so important. If I had singularly known that Bayard Rustin was an architect of the March on Washington, I read James Baldwin in high school. If someone had taken the time to tell me that James Baldwin was a Black queer man, and I'm a person, I'm guided to do much of the work that I do because I was a survivor of a suicide attempt in high school. Like, I thought I was so alone in the world. There was nobody like me, that I was like, okay, you're going to go to hell if you're gay, and you're going to go to hell if you commit suicide. Well, at least one of them's quicker, right? and it's, I chuckle about that, but it's not funny. And the reality is that, like, what kind of choice is that? What kind of two bad choices, and you're picking one over the other? And unfortunately, even in 2020, we still have young people that are contemplating that decision. And I think it's for them that I show up, and that I show up as my authentic self. It's for them that I show up in all the things that I do, so that they see, like, it's not just one thing. Your sexuality, your orientation isn't just who you have sex with or who you desire or who you want to be with. It informs the way you live life. It informs your good, your service, so many things about you.
Okay, Nadine, this next question is for you. So systemic racism is the constant delaying and at times preventing growth in the community. However, there is division internally within the community itself. Black and LGBTQ are not necessarily united. What are your thoughts on the cause of the split and steps to create unification?
Well, there's several answers I might give. One of them is that oppressed people become experts at oppression. Oppressed people, oftentimes hypermasculinity becomes one of the ways that the pushback against oppression occurs. And in that context of hypermasculinity, the policing of gender roles becomes extremely strident. And so the existence of LGBTQ people challenges that, challenges what gender roles are, what they mean. And so, for many of us, we've had the experience of sort of fighting to be ourselves, fighting to live out loud and honestly. And in our families where we have overcome a lot of the resistance, sometimes we are the ones that sort of liberate our families to live in their truths about other things, about who they are, and to let go of these, these false constructed identities where, men can't feel, can't express, can't emote, can't be tender, can't be, all of these things. And so, and I think the inability to access the full range of who you can be at any given time is lethal to the spirit and corrosive to the body. And so, I think right now what we are seeing is more bridges. I call it the family reunion, the homecoming. So many of us who left our homes to go to cities where we might be more, accepted. We're encouraged to leave by family members. We're, right now is a moment of people reaching back out and saying, you can't say Black Lives Matter if you don't mean all Black Lives Matter. And that means auntie, who lives with her partner, and that means, the son that went far away because he couldn't be who he is. It's all of that. So I look at, I invoke the Black Lives Matter movement very specifically because the architects of what has become a movement bigger than any individual really rooted the messaging in full inclusion, centered the lives of women, centered the lives of the LGBTQ community. We're part of the LGBTQ community. So in the protests here in St. Petersburg, it has been, sort of astonishing, and it has lifted my spirit to see people not only calling out George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but also invoking the names of trans women, Black trans women who've been murdered. And our message has been, you've got to bring that same energy to what is an epidemic of violence against Black trans women. So I think that there is a shift that is happening. There was a viral video where a woman just smacked this little boy who was dancing to, it might've been Christina Aguilera or some diva. And she just slaps him. He's a little boy, maybe he's 8 or 9, and tells him not to move his body like that, like a girl. And it's devastating to witness this video that just was everywhere. But what was different this time was the mother of that child responded to it and said, she was furious that, I think it was her sister or an aunt of some that had done this, and that they support their child. You were seeing, Dwayne Wade and Magic Johnson, you're seeing high profile people stand, shoulder to shoulder with their kids and push back against those stereotypes. So there is a shift that is happening, and this idea that there's no place for Black LGBTQ, same gender loving people within the Black family is being dismantled, at a rapid speed right now, and it is long overdue. And the reality is, it can be extremely isolating to be caught between the sort of homophobia on one side and racism on the other, while trying to navigate your place in the world. So for me, it has felt like a homecoming to be able to march against police brutality, to speak up, and not feel that sense that I have to choose, am I Black today, am I a lesbian today? No, I'm me every day, everywhere I go.
That's great. So Tim, this question is for you, thinking as your role in education. Have you received any negative pushback from colleagues, administrators, or parents? I know you spoke earlier a little bit about this, or at least about some of the perceptions or stereotypes, but have you received any pushback?
It's the biggest way to combat a lot of that bigotry, homophobia, implicit bias, explicit bias, is to show up as your best, excellent self. I think I've had to learn in my journey. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where they say, well, a certain kind of dog or a pit bull can smell your fear, right? Even when I fake it, I walk up in a building like I'm supposed to be there, like I'm excellent, like I have something that people need. And I've done this, in religious or church settings, even though I'm pretty humanist myself. If a PK, maybe that helps out because I grew up in the church. I've done it in education spaces. And I think, part of it is, my mother said to me one time, she said, when you did come out or let people in or let us in or invite us in, it wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. Like you were very clear, this is my truth. And I would love for you to join this journey with me, but I'm also prepared to leave some people behind if it's something that you don't agree with. And I think that's that critical difference in the paradigm between what my brother and friend who introduced me to this term, letting people in. It was Karamo Brown, actually, many, many moons ago. We were friends, good friends. And he said, when you come out, it makes you the spectacle, right? Like you are doing something to people. And he's like, no, he's like, letting people in, you're just being yourself. And if they feel a way about it, the onus is on them, right? It makes them the spectacle. It makes the reaction that people have to your true self the spectacle. So I try to show up in spaces like that. I am being my best authentic self. I'm bringing all my Black wonderful excellence. And if you don't want it, right? Oh, well, that's unfortunate, right? And I think one thing that's really promising for me as we talk about these topics a bit more, as we have, as you mentioned, celebrities that are now speaking out and saying that, and it's disheartening when you see comments on threads that are so homophobic or that are saying the Wades are awful people and parents because they support their trans kid. But you still have people that push back, right? That's something I didn't see when I was growing up. It was all in one direction. And I think that tide is moving. And I think there are kids that are growing up that are self-confident and assured and excellent. So I think that's part of it for me. Is like I have experienced it. I have experienced that pushback. But I just show up and I say, like, I have something that I think people need. And I actually had two women at an elementary school front desk say, oh, I tried not to like you when I found that out about you. And she admitted it. This was later. She said, when I first met you, I had things in my head and being around kids and XYZ. And she said, you know what? You showed up so consistently. She said, if you were nervous or anxious, you paid it. Like, and some of it is performance, but it's like you showed us and demonstrated that you were a contributor and a benefit to our community. And so that's my challenge to Black LGBTQ folk in professional spaces, nonprofit spaces. Show up like you belong there, because you do. And the Black community needs us. The Harlem Renaissance, the Black Arts Movement, the March on Washington. You can't name anything Black that wouldn't have happened without us being up in there in the mix, right? So walk with that confidence, but we have to educate people that we've already been in the mix.
I was kind of taken aback when you first mentioned that, but I think the beautiful part of that is that one, you said she told you years later, but two, it was you showed up as your authentic self and you expanded someone else's worldview. And so just by you being there, who you were, those stereotypes or those thoughts that she held were challenged. And then she was open enough to be like, wait a minute, this is what I thought, but this is what I see. So that, I guess that leads to more reason why we should show up as our authentic self, but it doesn't always feel safe, as you're thinking about, even as just if we took out, parts of it, well, I guess you can't, but if you think about it, it's like, we show up to some of these spaces and the environments are so not made for us that you kind of like tiptoe in. So what type of advice would you give people about showing up, as their full authentic self?
During COVID, my wife and our 9-year-old son and our dog, we all went on a epic road trip, 65 days, 3,294 miles, 28 states. And I had been on Facebook groups, one which was for people who have this particular camper, and the other was, Black People Camp Too. And that was about, sort of helping to navigate the safety, does anybody know anything about this campground? Any recommendations? And so I had been on those Facebook groups for a while before we started this adventure. And what I realized was the insidiousness of the closet. And by that, I mean, it, from childhood, it seeks to protect me, even when I don't want it to. So if I get on a plane, I say, and someone asks me what I do, I have a rule that I will not say I work for a nonprofit or I work for Equality Florida. I will say I work for the statewide lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender education advocacy organization, because I know that the closet reflexively in me will end me. And so as we were on this journey, I realized that I had announced to these two universes on Facebook that we were taking this trip, but I did it by saying 2 adults, 1 child, 1 dog, an open road. And it was sort of a clever, and I showed a picture of the camper and the pickup truck, but it was a clever way of avoiding identifying who those 2 adults were and who they were to each other. And there was no picture of my family. So I made a point because it's one of those things where when I say the closet is insidious, was I aware of it when I sent it? Not completely consciously, but there was some part of me that understood this reflexive thing. And so I ended up posting the picture of my wife and our son, at the Badlands. And I thanked everybody for their tips and all of that. And I said, and especially for the support for my family at a time when there can be a lot of hostility toward difference. And I really sort of braced for impact. I played it cool, but I was bracing for impact. And the response on both threads was overwhelmingly supportive. And it opened the door where a number of people came out. And so my advice to people is, of course, there are moments of safety that we all have to navigate. I navigate as a woman, as a Black person, and as a lesbian. But for the most part, those fears are self-generated. And the cost of what shame does to us, what the cost of getting into the closet is way too high. And, risk a few ugly words from strangers who don't matter to you to begin with over the internal dialogue that allowed you to not be truthful, not to disrespect your relationship, to not own who you are in the world or the people you love in the world. Push back against that, because most of the time it's not about safety, it's about discomfort that somebody might say something that is unkind. So instead you turn those unkind words into the inner dialogue that has you tucking back into the closet like you're a child again.
Oh, thank you. I think we are just at the time for questions from social media.
Yes, we are. Let me turn off my equipment because I'm in the vehicle. Okay. So we have our first question from Mr. Tim West. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
The first question is from Charles N79. What advice would you provide a gay male to discuss his sexuality with his straight friends? What advice would you give a gay male in discussing his sexuality with his straight friends?
Yes, that's an interesting question. And there's no one way to do it. I think it depends on who your friends are.
True.
There may be spaces where it's not a safe thing to do, right? I think you have to gauge, are these people? And so I think for me, when I was in that space more, which is more so college, I would toss out topics just to kind of glean a sense of where people stood on things, just to get a gauge for where they were, because I think there's some risk involved, right? But then I also think this notion again of coming out it's like an announcement. Like, you know, it's not like I showed up at a school or a job and said, "Hi, by the way, my name is Tim West, and you know, I like guys," right? I think when who you are becomes a natural part of your existence, that it's more about living your life the way that you do. And you know what? If you're bold enough to ask me, I'm bold enough to tell you. That's kind of that's kind of my rule of thumb now. And so I recall getting to a point where I was so comfortable, you know, for example, a good case in point at barbershops. I love going to the barbershop. But I remember when I got to the point where, you know, there's a lot of toxic masculinity and fragile masculinity sometimes in barbershops. But I got to the point where, you know, when someone was asking me to, you know, amen them on on one being like hyper aggressive or vow to a woman that was walking by or that come in the spot, I'd be like, well, you know, like that's I don't play for that team. You know, I'm in the guys, but you know, and I also think you shouldn't talk to that young woman that way, right? And it's so interesting because in those same barbershops, one, you'd be surprised, like, I don't know, maybe they're like, oh, Timmons come in, like, let's act nice. But the fact that I don't hear those kind of comments while I'm there, right? And I think about all my friends who say they have anxiety about going to barbershops, they don't feel affirmed, they have to hear all kind of things. You are paying somebody a lot of money to give you a haircut. And I think we forget the power of our dollar, the power of the relationships that we hold, and the meaning that we have for our straight friends. So I think for me, building that confidence in my friendships, you know, it's hard for someone to reject you or turn you away that actually genuinely knows you. And so I think when you have that fear, it's like, are you opening up to people in such a way that allows them to be invited into your life? Because you should know your friends. If they're your friends, you should have a sense of, you know, where they stand on some of these issues. And there might be a way, the best way to do it may not be in a group, right? It may be one-on-one in a conversation. It may be over a TV show or a topic that kind of mentions it, where you actually kind of get a sense of their opinion on it, and then you get to sort of assert yourself in it. But yeah, there's no one way, you know, but I do encourage it, because I think friends who don't know who you are can't really be very great friends.
Thank you for that. Okay, the next question is for Nadine. This question comes from Samantha 2. I am interested in using my voice to fight for equality of Black LGBTQ people. What is the first step I should take?
Well, I think that the place that we all have the most impact is in our immediate circle, our family, our friends, the community where we live. And I would seek out first to live honestly with the people around you, and then seek out the organizations that you see doing that work. And if you don't know of any organizations in your area, you know, send me an email, nadine@equalityflorida.org, and I can help connect you with folks who can be helpful. And then, of course, there's some national organizations. But I also am a big advocate of knowing the history of our people within the Black community. You know, Tim talked about the Harlem Renaissance. Most people in our community have no idea just how much the LGBTQ community were the driving force, the intellectual force, the mentors of so much of what we think of as the civil rights movement. Steeping ourselves in that knowledge can really help you get past this false narrative that says that Black is straight and white is gay, and if you are part of the LGBT community, your loyalties are divided, and some, you know, the sort of subtext of a lot of what we end up hearing. And so I would say educating yourself and being steeped in the understanding that we have always been a part, not just a part of this community, but leadership within this community towards civil rights and equality. And I think all of those things can be helpful, but I am happy if anybody is interested in activism to sort of point you in the direction of some of the organizations I think are doing really good work. And also to realize that that work does not necessarily have to happen within the auspices of an organization that is specifically LGBT. You know, when it came to marriage equality, the NAACP national leadership voting to support marriage equality, even before President Barack Obama was fully on board, was a big part of shifting the conversation in our country. So that activism may or may not happen within an LGBT specific organization. There may be a place where you begin to open the door and expand their understanding of what the obligation is to the full community. And I mentioned earlier a pastor that I've been working with, quite recently, who's really ready to take on, some of those caricatures, some of those negative stereotypes are sort of baked in the religious traditions embedded in our community. And so the obligation to undo that, to undo those lies against our community, also rests within our faith leadership as well.
Thank you. All right, the last question is for Tim West. This comes from Cinnamon Brown #1. It says, I read you are a poet and hip hop artist. Do you incorporate your art form into your work? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's actually, when we talk about our full and authentic selves, that's something I also had to learn, that there are respectability politics around who we show up as creatives, and integrating my creative self into my education work. I mean, for a long time, I think people were like, well, oh, you're a rapper, right? Like, I couldn't be like an education advocate doing work on the Hill and also do hip hop, right? So people want to compartmentalize you. And I think when we talk about bringing our full authentic selves, there are other aspects of our identity that are also important. So yes, I absolutely do where I can. I think fundamentally I'm a writer, and my writing shows up in different ways, sometimes as policy, sometimes as instructional leadership or curriculum, sometimes as a poem, sometimes as a rap song. And I think also as Black people, creative work, the arts weaves its way into all of who we are and what we do best. And so I think one of the ways that we can challenge like sort of white dominant professional culture is creating spaces where we can celebrate. Like, we should have drums at our events and celebrate dance and have music, because that's part of that's part of how we gather and bring people together. We should absolutely have food. I love going to gatherings that got food, right? And we can do that healthy as well. But I think, we can bring those different aspects of ourselves. There have been spaces, I will say, where people will discount your intelligence or your experience because they know that you're a rapper, right? But I think that's about, again, challenging stereotypes of how people think about rap, what people think about rap music. And some of that happens, again, with anti-Blackness within our own communities, because we've been ingrained and been taught certain things. If you wear your hair, when I had locks, Nadine, I remember I got the most criticism from Black people about my locks, especially as a guy that had long locks, and it was told like, oh, well, don't you think that's unprofessional? I'm like, don't you think I'm going to write that grant better than the other person? Let's talk about that. So I think you again, having to challenge those ideas around professionalism, but also like bringing your authentic self, bringing your best self. And I think that's when we begin to shift people's ideas that we can bring our creative selves, we can bring our LGBT selves to spaces.
Well, thank you. That was all the questions we had.
I just want to say, Tim, I'm really, one of the best things about this is I've gotten to meet you, and
yes, I'm going to. I was saying that we got to exchange information because you're awesome, exactly. and I do some of the work I do is in tech and is in Florida, and my partner is in Florida. So yeah, we definitely need to connect.
Yeah, Nadine at equalityflorida.org.
Right down now. I'll send you an email.
Okay, please do. And I'm a big hip hop fan. I'm also a big battle rap fan, which is a whole other.
Interesting.
All right.
Okay, so thank you to Nadine and Timon for all of the insight that you gave us tonight. I think, like I said earlier, it gives us so much room to think about what we all can do in terms of allowing people to show up authentically. I think we have both the challenge of how do we support that, but then how do we show up authentically? How do we fight against those safety nets or quote unquote safety nets that we sometimes revert back to and really show up as ourselves? And how do we expand these spaces so that it's not just a picture on the wall, but that there is true inclusion and integration into these different types of workspaces. So thank you all for everything that you gave us tonight. I learned so much. And this was the day 4 of the summit. We only have one more day left. And I have to say, I have learned so much this week. Each conversation builds on the next. And so I am excited to hear what comes up tomorrow. And we hope that you all can join us tomorrow for day 5.
Thank you.
Thank you.